I'd smoke 2 cigarettes in 10 minutes. The coffee break, and we will have some very interesting speakers that will further elaborate on the presentation of Arnold Tucker and Jaco Karoshi. We have first Nadim-OECD that I will introduce, and then after that Steve Landeveld, who came to me, since when am I a rock star? So he has to explain that to me too. I couldn't give him an immediate answer.
I'm sorry.
But it is all four are equally important, but we have them in a certain order to build up, the suspense in this session. So that's basically why we're all there. That said, Steve is definitely a rock star. Now, Nadim, for those who do not know him, he is a dear friend and head of the Trade and Productivity section in the Statistics Directorate of the OECD. And he is leading a lot of the work that we actually talk about around national supply and use table, asymmetries, the addressing of firm heterogeneity, and of course also the new sort of statistics and indicators that we aspire to have to explain the interrelationship in the globalization in terms of trade and value-added indicators. I look forward to that presentation. It is based on an extensive work over the years, Nadim, that you have been able to bring together also with the research department. And to some extent, it raises the bar even higher that I would think of where he wants to go, and talk a little bit also what has been here coined as the boxes in which we have to start thinking and bringing the various sort of elements together. And I think that's also important. And I hope, Jaco, you like the presentations because he takes statistics into a new light of policy applications. Nadim, with that, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ivo, for the introduction. And thank you, Energy, for organising this, this fantastic conference with a number of great faces. Many are familiar and some are new, so I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk today. As I begin, I'd like to go back to Arnold's introduction, where he did himself a disservice. I think that the discussions that we've had in the previous two presentations illustrate really the drivers of some of our work, and it makes my life easier standing here following them. So I think the analogy of the rock star is perhaps slightly imperfect, but I will work with it anyway. I think I view Arnold and Jaco as being songwriters, and we are the musicians that are asked to play the tune and try to work out what type of instruments we need to go forward. But without the royalties going to you. But we'll try and do our best to try to measure those royalties, as you will see as I go forward. So I mean, this presentation really is going to be looking at how we respond to the policy debate, how we respond really to giving policy people, like the two of you here, the results that they need, and thinking about how we can be more proactive going forward. So I'll focus a little bit initially on what we're doing today, but then also I want to focus really on where we're going in the future, because I think that's really what we need to do. And we had the intervention where we spoke about boxes, and this categorization of boxes and the categorization of firms is central to the way that we need to think about this new type of integrated economic accounting framework that's going to allow us to really tackle some of the issues that we see emerging through global value chains. So just by way of introduction, I mean, we live in this interconnected world. Much of this will be familiar, so I'll be very brief in terms of how I run through this. But the phenomena that we have today is the international fragmentation of production. So within what we now characterize as this global factory, we don't really have the same type of view of the world that we had perhaps in the 19th century. Now, statistical information systems, to some extent, reflect the way the world was structured and the way the production was structured, say 20, 25 years ago. And we need to think anew about how we can go forward. I mean, certainly on the landscape, we have a number of phenomena that drive us to think differently about the way that we have to approach economic accounting. And M&Es, of course, run coach and horses through the accounting system. We know that there have always been this phenomena of transfer pricing that we've struggled to deal with. But now, of course, we have these elaborate flows of intellectual property products which create massive challenges in terms of differentiating property income and trade and services. But we also have increasingly supply mode 3 type transactions where you see the installation of an affiliate somewhere else and providing services that are not a million miles away from the conventional trade and services, but just using a slightly different mechanism. And then, of course, on the landscape, we have new types of producers. We have the phenomena of factorless producers, we have processors, we have special purpose entities, And all of these provide challenges for the way that we record interactions in the economic accounts, and of course complicate our ability to measure activity and indeed the global value chain phenomena more generally. So what type of issues do they present problems for? I mean, the first, of course, is one we're very familiar with, the double counting of trade. We see this explosion of intermediate inputs in the production process, and it's blurred our ability to understand who really trades with who, and which final demand users are driving, if you want, production somewhere upstream in the value chain. We can't see these things using conventional statistics. I mean, they even challenge the old worldview about imports more generally. Are they good or are they bad? I mean, when we know that imports are essential for production, we have a very different view of the mercantilist view of the world. Now, of course, there are many other issues that are presenting complications, and double counting of FDI flows, there's capital in transit, are creating real issues. And so we have now to move towards this notion of what we call real FDI. Now, all of these things coalesce, if you want, to create the challenge in a very simple way, that they blur the line between things like GNI and GDP. And increasingly in some countries, you're seeing the discussion or the macroeconomic policy moving away from looking just at GDP to also embracing GNI, because all of these things are to some extent embodied in the distinction between the two. So the problem, of course, is that we produce our current statistics, as I said, using perhaps a different view of the world. And we produce our statistics using disconnected data sources. So I refer to it here as a stovepipe view of the world. You know, we have business registers which are used to create a wide array of business statistics, and I refer to structural business statistics, the national accounts, foreign affiliate trade statistics, and maybe in some countries trade and services data, and also FDI data. But on the other hand, we have, for the global phenomena, the trade registers, where we have merchandise statistics being drawn from them, trade and services again in some countries. So in a nutshell, we live in an interconnected world, but we're using disconnected data to try to measure this phenomena. And that's perhaps not optimal. And so we need to think more broadly about how we can better serve the community of policymakers, whilst, of course, making sure that we don't impose an overwhelming burden on NSOs to create this unified, integrated message. Now, of course, these phenomena manifest themselves in very different ways. Within countries, you see incoherence in the underlying data sources, which cause major problems. But of course, across countries, you see huge problems. And we're all familiar with the problems that we observe in bilateral trade data, where one country's exports and not another country's imports. And so these are all challenges that we have to confront head on and try to think about this within this coordinated, integrated accounting framework. So how are we responding? And I'll talk mainly about the work that's going on at the OECD at the moment. Generally, we need to have a response that recognizes that interconnected economies require interconnected, integrated statistics. And within the OECD, of course, we've developed the guidelines for FDI flows, where we try to remove the double counting by trying to remove the capital in transit from SPEs. But this isn't the full story. It's only part of the story for dealing with what we call real FDI. Then, of course, we have other activities in collaboration with Eurostat to link trade and business registers to provide the information about the characteristics of firms, which has been central to the discussion that we've had in the two previous presentations. These boxes, the categories of firms that we need information on. You know, what type of firms export, what type of firms import. These are all standard questions from policymakers, but for a long time we didn't have standard responses to them, and we're now beginning to develop the statistical infrastructure that allows us to have this coherent picture of these phenomena. Now, lastly, of course, we have TIVA, and I will talk more about what TIVA is and how we plan to move forward. But really, it's about improving international coherence fundamentally in trade data, but also providing, if you want, new indicators on global value chains more generally. So I can be very brief here, I think, in terms of what TIVA is, but I'll talk about it in the context of a few different strands. So first and foremost, it's a statistical initiative, and it's a means that allows us to better understand the relationships between countries, looking at it from a value-added perspective. So rather, for example, than looking at just gross trade flows, where we see that country A has a direct relationship with country B, and country B has a direct relationship with country C, but country A has no obvious relationship with country C, we look at the underlying value-added flows, and we can observe, or we can illustrate using a TIVA-type approach, that country A and country C have a strong economic relationship when it's looked at in value-added terms as opposed to gross trade terms. Now, the way that we do that is by creating a global input-output table, and I'll say more about the construction of the table very briefly in the following slides. But what else is TIVA? TIVA is a response, as you can see, to policy demands, and very high policy demands. We have an awful lot of users at the OECD banging down the door saying we need this information, as they have done for many years. And interestingly, of course, we've had a few mandates, including from the G20, starting here in Mexico, in Los Cabos in 2012, where the ministers themselves called for the OECD, WTO, and UNCTAD to work together to try to provide a better narrative and better data for the global value chain phenomena. And within the OECD for a number of years now, the ministerial meetings that we've had, every meeting, the trade ministers call for more information on global value chains. And last year in particular was stunning because there was a tour de table of trade ministers, and every single one of them started with the importance of making sure that TIVA continued. And that really is a bit of a wake-up call for the statistical community. I've never been in a meeting with ministers who start off by talking about the need for better quality statistics and the need to make sure that this statistical initiative continues. Normally, of course, statistics is the poor relation for ministers, but here it's in the spotlight. So what else is TIVA? It's a collective effort, and we launched it in 2013 together with the WTO. We had our first data release. But it's also something that recognizes that in order to measure a global phenomena, we need a global approach. And so we work very closely in collaboration with other agencies, and thus far we've had a very close working relationship with the US ITC, IDE JETRO, and indeed the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. But also we use the mechanics within the OECD to make sure that we have feedback from the policymakers and, of course, a range of countries to which we can sell the story and have the message disseminated. And basically, within a number of different OECD Working Party meetings, we have the Trade and Goods and Services Working Party meeting, the National Accounts meeting, Industry and Innovation meeting, and the Trade Committee. These are all fora that provide us with an opportunity to discuss the statistical aspects of TIVA, but also to make sure that we use the policy levers that are available to go back home and make sure that the resources are available at the national level to try to develop the infrastructure that's needed going forward. So that's not all, of course, in terms of international cooperation. I mean, it's important that we continue to institutionalize the idea of TIVA and indeed the national building blocks that are needed to produce TIVA. And so we've developed the process of having a memorandum of understanding with Eurostat, where we'll be officially, collectively move forward trying to improve TIVA within this collective umbrella. And we've also begun a formal collaboration with APEC, active collaboration with UNESCO and UNECLAC. In the next few weeks, we will be beginning discussions with the African Development Bank to start thinking about how TIVA can be measured in Africa. Because this is a global initiative. When we talk about global value chains, it's not good enough to just focus only on a core group of countries, for example, those in the OECD. And of course we don't, as I will show you in a following slide, but it's absolutely essential that all countries try to embrace the idea within their statistical information systems, and so we can develop the full story. Now, just as a follow-up word, I mean, this has been given extraordinary high priority by the OECD. I mean, it's one of the top 2 or 3 projects being developed in the OECD, and it cuts across a broad range of different directorates at the OECD, some statistical, some policy. And we want to mainstream, and we have mainstreamed the whole idea within our core work program going forward. So that's a way of reassuring people, of course, that this isn't going away. It's a permanent part of the OECD's activity. So just briefly in terms of the output, what do we do so far? Well, using the information that's available at the national level, we've created a series of global input-output tables for the years that you see up there. The next release will be available next month, covering these years and indeed more countries. It's going to be updated annually. And what we try to do, of course, is disseminate the information in a meaningful way. It's not very easy because there's a range of indicators, some more complicated than others, but we recognize that people want to look at the results rather than the way that the results are produced, and so we have a series of messages that come from TIVA, and if I have time, I will talk about what some of those emerging messages are. So very briefly, in terms of the coverage that we have in the database at the moment, we have 57 economies, those that are listed there, and the next release will have another 4 countries added, so we'll have 61 economies, with 34 sectors being released. And that's up from our first release, where we had 18 sectors, as you can see here. And these are the 34. Difficult to see, but you see there's an expansion throughout, both in manufacturing and indeed in services. Now, I'll just take the opportunity of skipping this, just in case I run out of time, but I'll come back to what the latest release tells us. But how do we do it? So as I said, we have a global input-output table, and Arnold very thankfully provided some illustration of what a global supply use or global input-output table looks like. But our starting point is national data. It's national input-output tables and national supply use tables. And of course, we have to have coherent, good quality bilateral trade data. Now, if you look on this chart here in terms of the color, the really important parts in terms of measurement are the purple parts. And the particularly important parts are the purple parts that you see within what we consider to be the conventional use table. So the Z components that are colored in purple. There, of course, we have to use bilateral trade data and allocate them to using firms. And of course, if we have difficulties with asymmetries in bilateral trade data, it creates great challenges in terms of producing a coherent messages. But that's what we have to do in the system at the moment. And so focusing resources on improving the quality of gross trade data is essential to have top quality TIVA data. So where are the challenges? I briefly discussed one of them, but in a nutshell, the challenges are really all about data. And they're about data availability and data coherence. Now, bilateral trade statistics, of course, is the key area where we have challenges in terms of trade asymmetries. And I've highlighted the most problematic areas within the overall production of a global input-output table in blue. Certainly, the key challenge, of course, is making sure that we have coherent trade data, coherent bilateral trade data. Now, for many years, of course, this is one of those almost a running joke within the statistical community that we had these differences, and there was no real focus or emphasis on resolving those, apart from perhaps some type of projects. Eurostat certainly had been doing something for years, but there was what was missing, of course, was a global effort to make sure that the asymmetries were taken seriously. Because fundamentally, the view, certainly until recently, had been that we produce national statistics. And if we say that we export this, then that's what we say. We don't really care if somebody else is saying they import different amount from us. So the challenge, of course, is to getting the message across that coherence at the international level is crucial to providing this coherent story. Re-export data is also, if you want, a poor relation of the bilateral trade system. And not all countries provide information about re-exports. And I'm defining re-exports here as those imports that pass through an economy without any further transformation. But these are essential to have within the TIVA system because they're really part and parcel of the issue related to heterogeneity. At the moment, and as I will discuss more in more detail coming up, the problem that we have within TIVA estimates, of course, is that we have to assume homogeneity of firms allocated to a given sector, both in terms of their production and also in terms of where and how they export. And if we have a significant share of re-exports going to one country rather than another, that will distort the estimates that we see in TIVA. Finally, of course, of this important list, I mean, they're supporting import flow matrices. Not all countries produce systematically import flow matrices that support their supply use and input-output tables. But although this is a recommendation within the SNA, this information should be made available. And so we encourage all countries to make sure that they put in place the resources that allow the import flow matrices to be developed with best quality possible. I will say one final word in terms of one of the items not listed in blue. The ability to reconcile the merchandise trade and trade and services data with the national accounts, supply use and input-output tables is also an issue. We've experienced, I mean, Arnold raised this point in the context of ex-IOPOL, where he said that the starting point is to make sure that what you observe in the supply use table doesn't change. And so you look at the bilateral trade data to provide you with estimates of the relationships, the partner shares, as opposed to the value. Sometimes we observe that there are quite significant inconsistencies with the underlying merchandise trade and services data and the supply use tables. What you observe sometimes is that there will be an export of a particular product that doesn't appear to be the case within a supply use table. And there you have significant challenges. And so a focus on making sure that there's a reconciliation of supply use and merchandise trade data is essential. At the moment, in many cases, there's still, if you want, a decoupled view of how these statistics are compiled. Many countries, of course, make sure that the merchandise trade data is central to the production of supply use tables, but that's not the case in all countries, and it can provide problems. Now, I'm not going to go through too much detail here in terms of some trade asymmetries, because we do have a session later on where we're talking about trade asymmetries more generally, and indeed how we can try to resolve trade asymmetries. But I did want to highlight just one particular example just to illustrate the scale of the problem. This is the trade and services data that we have at the OECD, and I've looked at the position of the UK in terms of its reporting and the position of its reported exports to a number of countries. Now, if you look, for example, on the left-hand side, the UK exports $60 billion to the US of services. The US says it imported $45 billion from the UK. If you look on the import side of things, the UK imported $29 billion, so it says, and the US says it exported $52 billion. Now, what you have is the UK saying that they have a trade surplus with the US of about $30 billion in services, and the US saying it has a trade surplus of about $7 billion with the UK. So both have trade surpluses with each other. So that in a nutshell is the scale of the problem that we have in some areas, and certainly in trade and services we know is everyone's got a surplus, so we should go away, pack up now. The world is a better place. And of course, fundamental to producing global input-output tables are good quality supply use and input-output tables. Now, our preference, of course, is that countries adopt the SNA and produce annual supply use tables according to the guidelines of the SNA. And that is an absolute requisite. You know, in the absence of countries producing the tables, we will have to take perhaps a table where it's available and project it forward. So if we have 1994 for one country, we'll have to project 1995. But countries themselves should try and make sure that the resources are available to develop supply use tables, if only because, of course, they remain the best tool for creating coherent estimates of GDP. Now, again, I reinforce the point, supporting import flow tables, because it's absolutely essential that countries have this information. We do it at the OECD in the absence of countries, and we use relatively sophisticated methods to develop the import flow matrices, but we were never going to be able to make a good job of it as it can be done at the national level. Now, of course, finally, periodical input-output tables to supplement the supply use tables is also essential, because whilst we can use standard algebra, standard matrix conversion techniques to move from supply use to input-output, countries themselves are always going to be in a better position to make that conversion than we are. Now, an important question, I think, certainly in terms of thinking about the future, is that enough? Is it enough to have a story about TIVA? And I think that the answer is, well, despite the fact that the TIVA initiative itself was well received, and on the day of the TIVA release, this was what came out in the press, just a very small sample of just how well it was picked up and received, it's clear that we have more to do. Certainly more to do in terms of improving the quality of data, but also more to do in terms of making sure that we cover all bases covered by the global value chain phenomena. At the moment, we're looking at things fundamentally through a trade perspective when we talk about TIVA, but the development of a global input-output table and some of the extensions that I will develop and talk about in a second allows us to look at another stream of work, the really important trade and investment dimension. So what are we trying to do within the OECD? I mean, first and foremost, of course, is that the extension of TIVA needs to move towards some of the building blocks of what drive global value chains. And so we're talking about jobs and indeed the skills. When we talk about the fragmentation of production, we talk about, if you want, the allocation of different parts of the chain to different countries. And fundamentally, this is driven by comparative differences in skills and indeed natural resources in countries. But we don't have yet information on jobs and skills for all countries in the database. And so this is a really important part of the narrative going forward. Certainly jobs is something that can be done in some countries, but there are real challenges there in terms of ensuring coherence in jobs data and activity data. For years I've been banging on the door saying that in order to produce productivity estimates that are meaningful, countries need to provide good quality labour input data that's consistent with the value-added data. And that's not the case systematically in many countries. In many countries, they still use the labour force survey as being their proxy, if you want, for the activity data. And we observe big inconsistencies in some of these data, which gives us problems when we talk about productivity at the industry level. So there needs to be a focus on making sure that there's a coherence between jobs and value added. And also, of course, things like hours worked. But I'm going for the lower hanging fruit here. Skills, of course, is another challenge, but one that we'll have to take on board eventually, and we're looking at how to do that. Then, of course, there's the investment story, and we need to be able to talk about how investment, foreign direct investment, is driving value chains and how the benefits appreciate or accrue through the FDI chain. This is really about defining boxes. So just to illustrate the size of the issue, we have some provisional estimates at the OECD already that look at the jobs in the business sector that are being sustained by foreign final demand. And as you can see, in some countries, we're talking significant shares of jobs are being, if you want, sustained by consumers elsewhere. So it provides a very different narrative on the story. The problem, of course, is that at the moment, these estimates are produced on the understanding and the basis that the firms allocated to a particular industry group all behave the same. But we know, and we'll see this tomorrow in some of the presentations that discuss heterogeneity more generally, that firms that typically export will have higher labour productivity than those that don't. And indeed, they have many other characteristics that differentiate them from firms that don't export, which is why we need to have an extension to the framework. So this is an essential part of the process. I mean, differentiating between firms, having new boxes that allow us to identify those firms that engage in global value chains and how they engage in global value chains is essential. So why investment? Well, part of the investment story, of course, is just because we have to have something that we can link the trade and investment dimension. And it's fundamentally driven by the idea that we know that the proliferation of multinationals means that when we define value added, it's no longer the same sticky substance that it used to be. We know that a large part of value added that's being created by multinationals can be repatriated back to parents or somewhere else, Bermuda or wherever, and doesn't stay in the host economy. So when we talk today about trade and value added, we have to keep in mind that it's not necessarily providing you with a full picture of the benefits that accrue through value chains. Only one part of value added sticks, and that's generally the compensation of employees. There's another part that may stick, which is the taxes on the profits generated by the foreign affiliates. But of course, they will tend to be relatively small because by definition, they've been shifted there for sometimes tax reasons. But there is another reason, of course, why this is important. And the reason, of course, is that this distinction between what a trade and service is and what a payment for intellectual property is that's instead recorded as property income is becoming increasingly blurred. You can set up a foreign affiliate somewhere else and you can say that, well, for ostensibly tax reasons, I will transfer my intellectual property to my foreign affiliate and I will not pay, I will not record a trade and service export to my affiliate. What I will instead see is a repayment of property income because I have this affiliate using this free IPP. I'm not sure I'll be able to do 5 minutes, but I will try. And of course, we also have this issue in terms of the explosion that we see in modes of supply type 3. We know that if a foreign-owned affiliate locates itself in a different country, I mean, if it's basically providing goods and services in a different country, it's a different channel, if you want, to what we observe in trade and services, but not a million miles away. And the benefits, of course, that accrue through ownership and ownership of IPPs in particular go back to the parent. But it's another mechanism, another channel by which these flows are recorded. And it's important if we want to have a complete story on trade and investment that we need to have information about the creation, the value creation being generated by foreign-owned firms. Now, this is just to illustrate that it's important, because I'm going to be running out of time, but it is important. You can see that the value added of foreign affiliates in a range of European countries is significant across a broad spectrum of them. Certainly in Ireland, for example, half of total value added in the business sector is being generated by foreign-owned affiliates. And in China, when we talk about the export growers, the key industries for exports, we also see there that in high-tech exports, a large part of trade is being driven by foreign-owned firms. And of course, the issue there is how much of the value added being generated and recorded in China remains in China, is instead repatriated. So these are all issues that are important to provide this holistic narrative. Just to illustrate the size of the problem, this is what we see for Ireland for its value added to export ratios from TIVA in blue. Now, if you strip out just the gross operating surplus being generated by US-owned affiliates, you end up with what you see in red, a massive difference between the TIVA view of the world and the view of the world once you factor in ownership, which changes the trade balance by this much. So the US trade balance, if you correct for US-owned affiliates in Ireland, increases by $3 billion with the UK. So a significant change to the picture as we understand it today, and that in itself has been improved by TIVA. But still, TIVA doesn't provide you the whole story. Again, you can do things similar with China, and you see that the TIVA trade balance with the US is $62 billion less, but the surplus, once correcting, and this is very crude, is a further 16 billion. So once you take account of ownership, you again reinforce the story that there's more to this than meets the eye. So finally, in terms of going forward, it's essential that we deal with quality and improving heterogeneity. We've touched on some issues already in terms of the challenges that are presented by heterogeneity. I'll be very brief, but fundamentally the issue is that we classify firms at the moment using an industrial classification system or boxes that assume that they're generally the same, and we know that they're not. And so what we have to do, of course, is try to make sure that within the TIVA framework, or within the global input-output table that we develop, we have to differentiate between these firms in a new type of way. So one of the ways that we're approaching that is by creating this expert group on extended supply use tables within the OECD. And the fundamental driver for that work will be to try to make sure that we are able to better measure this heterogeneity phenomena by focusing on existing data sets. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, we know that we have a stovepipe approach of the world, but we want to be able to illustrate that using existing data like FATS and like tech, we're able to create links within the mainframe statistical information system to improve the quality of what we do today. And in the future, of course, I mean, ideally, I would love to be able to stand here in, say, 5 years' time and say we no longer collect FATS or tech data because they've been mainstreamed. When we talk about industrial activity, the starting point is not just industrial classifications, ISIC group, 2-digit. We talk about an activity, and within that activity, breakdowns of firms, for example, that exports, and firms, for example, that are foreign-owned. These are the characteristics that are important to differentiate between firms. And just the ISIC system on its own isn't sufficient, really, to be able to provide us with the overall picture. I won't go through all of these things. We will discuss these on Wednesday afternoon, and you're all welcome to join the discussion. So just very briefly, this is an illustration of the type of framework that we'd like to move towards developing. And so it's an integrated and extended supply use table that is slightly different from what you observe today, but not massively different. We still retain the view that we have industries, but within the industries, it's about making sure that heterogeneity is observed. And so here, the proposal is that we break down industries into different types of ownership, so foreign and domestic-owned firms, and then we have categories of firms that we classify as being exporters and non-exporters. And how we define exporters and non-exporters will depend on national data availability, and certainly, for example, existing data sets like tech can help in that respect. But we have to be, I think, quite careful about how we move forward. There will be challenges for some countries in terms of the information they provide because of confidentiality restrictions, but this is fundamentally the way that we'd like to move forward. And again, another extension within this framework is that exports have to be provided with a slightly additional information, and one of the key pieces of information is the re-export part. And this is a major challenge for the entrepot type countries like the Netherlands and Hong Kong, for example, where we see these can create significant problems within the TIVA data set. The import use table, here we can benefit from existing data collections. If you can link trade and business registers, then you have an ability to be able to improve the quality of the current import flow matrices. You're able to observe direct imports by firms and allocate them in a way that you improve the quality of the overall import flow matrix that even has this breakdown between foreign, domestic, export and non-exporter and so on. So much better quality. And ideally, of course, within the import flow matrix, and this is perhaps something that can be done today, is that rather than just show one table for total imports, we should encourage countries, or countries should be encouraged to move towards developing import flow tables that are broken down as far as possible by key partner countries, or indeed key regions. This is something that will significantly improve the quality of TIVA data. Similar, we have with a supply table, and here are some of the extensions that go beyond what I've referred to. I mean, this is really basically thinking even further blue sky from where we are at the moment. But it's essential to answer some other policy questions, how the property income payments generated by foreign affiliates, both abroad and in terms of those that are repatriated back home, are being recorded in the system. And this is really part of our work on what we refer to as base erosion profit shifting, where we know that there are issues surrounding tax avoidance, if you want, within multinationals. And at the moment, if people ask me, for example, what's the total tax paid by foreign multinationals in this industry, I cannot say. We don't really have the information to answer one of the most important policy questions that's being presented on a daily basis, but we can take the opportunity of thinking about the accounting framework to build these measures in from the outset. And you'll see here as well that in terms of the work that we're going to be exploring, we have the employment dimension and we have the CO2 emission data, which is part of our work already, but we also want to be able to improve the quality of what we do today by creating footprint estimates of carbon dioxide on the basis of these exporter, non-exporter, foreign-owned, domestic breakdowns. So very quickly in summary, much has already been done, but as you can see, we have a lot more to do. Fortunately, we have strong support and mandates from the G20, OECD trade ministers, and the Committee for Statistics and Statistical Policy within the OECD, where they all gave very strong mandates for the OECD to continue in this area. And we will, of course, continue to ensure that the issue is pushed continuously at all of our working party meetings so they can serve this broader agenda. We have and we continue to devote considerable resources to meeting these needs using both the frameworks that we're exploring with different regional bodies, but also, most importantly, we will also continue to use the leverage that we have within the OECD that allows us to have direct relations with our trade, our policy directorates, because that's absolutely essential. I mean, Jaakko made the observation earlier on that we cannot just produce statistics for the sake of it. We have to have drivers, and here we have a strong driver, and here we have strong channels within which those drivers can take benefit. So finally, basically the idea is that we'll continue to develop this international framework to mainstream global supply use tables, and indeed, as I've suggested, the extensions that are really important to answer all of the policy questions. Maybe 1 minute over. Thank you, Ivo.
Please. Yes, sir.
First, a question for clarifications. So you're talking about so we often talk about the supply use table and IO table together. So is the supply use table is much more close to the data source statistical agency can collect. The symmetrical IO table basically is the analytical table. It's not directly from the statistical source, but because different countries have different systems, so like China, so like Taiwan, they familiar with compile the C-by-C tables. So I think for the international guideline, you have to clarify this. What is more preferred? We more prefer, in my view, is more prefer supply use table. But for countries, they didn't have that, still not have that capacity yet. They can transfer. They can have a transition period, allow them to continue contribute IO tables. But in the final destination for 5 years or 10 years from now, we should consistent with the SNA standard. That is the supply use table. It's the core of the national account. Then you go to the international account, Stephen will present. Then the global SUT will be the core. Then you should transfer to a symmetric table from a SUT. Because you see, when you make the transfer, now it's 4 models. Every model have mistake, have the errors. So if you assembling the data from IO table, then you different countries IO convention have different errors. So I think the better is for the global, if you mainstream them, the better is have one global SUT. From there, you transfer. That's my suggestion, the first one. The second one is regarding about the heterogeneities. I think the Arnold have a very interesting presentation. That's from the environmental accounting point of view. They like more sector details. So that's I fully taking that point into account. But from the estimation of value added or foreign content or domestic content in trade, I think a lot of work has been done. For example, in 2005, Professor Limer lead a group of national experts. I think Professor Gary Graff is part of the group. What they compiled is a 9 commodity IO table from US. Then another one is 91 commodity tables. What do they conclude? the total difference for the value added for the 9-country table is about 9.5% is the foreign content. When they go to 91, it's 10.4%. So what do they conclude? It's not worth to invest the money to go more details. So that means give the difference, you will see for the environmental account, you might need more, especially decompose the agriculture, food, and mining sectors. But for the value added, maybe we can aggregate, very little aggregate, but more important is the form heterogeneity. Because exporting, importing, and also just like Nadim outlined, is the foreign ownership, domestic ownership, and who is export, who is not export. Thank you.
No, very interesting. You nicely pointed out some of the issues that we have to address globally, because it really affects the overall sort of estimates. And if these are becoming official statistics, these are the, an aspect of credibility, to what extent, the disaggregations we're starting to use, and that we use it, throughout as an harmonization aspect to the national supply and use table to allow us to do this kind of analysis. So these issues are really at the heart of that broader collaborative program to be able to address these issues, in a more credible way. I'm conscious about the time, and I would like to press on and ask.
Let me respond.
You want to? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, perhaps I should just say that there is. G used to work with us. I mean, he was a secondment for 3 months, so he's very familiar with the plans of the OECD in this field, and we benefited enormously from his presence. And as G knows, of course, the idea, of course, is to make sure that we develop global supply use tables and global input-output tables. And it's true that, of course, there's an important distinction that needs to be made between a global supply use and a global input-output table. The global input-output table is much more analytical than a global supply use table. But, of course, the results that you present in terms of global value chains are always going to be derived through a model like a global input-output table. But it is an important distinction to make, and it's one that we always make at the OECD, because we don't talk about the global input-output table or TIVA results as being official statistics, but they're sort of semi-official statistics based on official underlying data. Now, in terms of the heterogeneity, I think that you recapped, I guess, some of the issues that we're trying to explore within the expert group. It's essential, of course, that we do have a breakdown between the deals with heterogeneity, but I think that the important point really is that this needs to be done in a way that recognizes the resource burden in countries. Ideally, we would have 20,000 sectors and breakdowns in all sorts of different categories. But we know that's not feasible, and we know that countries won't do it. So what we have to do is cut our cloth accordingly. And the focus really is on making sure that we're able to better measure the phenomenon. This is why the approach that we're advocating is one that looks at the firm characteristics on the basis of their export intensities and their ownership, rather than having more detail by industrial classification, particularly because we know that the new SNA changes our interpretation of industrial classification systems anyway. We know, for example, that within a given sector, there will be firms that are factorialists, firms that are processors, but firms that own the goods that they use to create their output. So very different firms, but all allocated to the same sector. Our task is really to try to find a breakdown of those industrial activities in a way that's optimal and has the least impact in terms of burdens to NSOs, whilst maximizing data that's already being collected and it's available, and improving the overall coherence of the information system.
Dr. Sojo.
Thank you, Nadim, for the presentation. And I think the drivers are clear, and from the OECD and outside the OECD for this type of work. But I'm thinking that the national statistical offices will have a lot of burden after the SDGs are approved. So most of the work, the driver of the national statistical offices will be on the post-2015 agenda. My question is there anything of the results of this type of work already on the SDGs, on the goals of the open group, or not?
Well, I think the answer to that is probably no, but I mean, certainly, your institution already has led the way in many respects in terms of what's feasible. Your supply use tables that you break down that talk about global manufacturing is really almost a poster child of the work that we're trying to push more broadly at the international level. I mean, certainly the work that you've done and the work that China have done have demonstrated the feasibility and the importance of this work. I mean, we can no longer rest on our laurels and think that the information that we produce today is good enough. And the work that we've seen from you, and indeed from others, illustrates that it really isn't. And we have to make sure that we provide the information in a much more meaningful way that captures this real heterogeneity in firms.
I see two hands, and they are recognizing they will be able to make an intervention. Dr. Sojo, in my opinion, it is part of the SDG program, particularly on the environmental side, on issues around resources, energy use, that definitely are part of the SDG program. That's also why we should drive this program in that broader context. So in my introduction, I made that reference because I think that part of the work that we're talking about, particularly also around the national supply and use table, are definitely part of that work that we have to bring forward in providing the information necessary for the new indicators of the Sustainable Development Goal environment. So that is happening. The global indicators in terms of TIFA are not there, but at the national level, as an input from the national supply and use table in that broader sort of system of environmental economic account, is really at the heart of the drivers of the SDG program. So I think that's definitely is a program of that better sort of environment, greener, more jobs, and part of the SDG program. Even part of that data revolution, so to speak, as in that broader partnership, in working together on these data is definitely part of that overall program. I see Ronald and our colleague from INSEE. Please, you first. Oh, Ronald is at the back. Ronald first, go. Because he has the mic.
Yeah, just very short because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
So just as a comment that there is a trade goal or trade target in the goal under means of implementation. So to support the implementation, and of course within economic growth, I would guess the trade and value added would be part of that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the comprehensive presentation. First, I think that we have to keep the both legs, storytelling and boxes. And I like the way you insist on knowledge assets, knowledge relative assets. And I would like to stress one point. I think that what is destabilizing, this word exists, so is the fact that we reflect with local factors. Actually, Rowling, Samuelson, Ricardo, local factors. But now we have at least one global factor, which is information, in the form of assets, in the form of what you want, patents, etc. But what global? And the allocation of the use and the cost of that global factor could be more or less conventional. So I think that we have to push that kind of theory and of idea to help people understand why there is the difficulty. Second, I will be more brief. About boxes. You spoke about foreign and domestic, and we have a discussion for Wednesday. I think, and we see, that it is a past view. The bad or Salvatore, foreign and the domestic. But within domestic, there are also global players. So the question is, global players, foreign control, global players, domestically control, and others. Even though we will miss the capacity of transfer. Third, I don't really well understood what is behind the idea of real FDI. So maybe you can explain later, I don't know. Several years before, I told a story of foreign direct investment coming and return, describing how much real capital is behind underlying foreign direct investment, how much value added is behind, how much total income is behind, and how much income goes out. And maybe you speak about that, but to describe that, you need to insist on enterprise group relationships and the problem of leverage between ownership and control. And maybe in terms of challenges for statistical institutes, it would be very, very important to develop and to insist of the necessity of a framework about ownership relationship. Fourth, it's good to insist on non-exporting, exporting players and to separate them. But I'm afraid that we can go too we can do it too much, because non-exporting play their role to help the capacity and the efficiency of exporting firms. And there is some relationship that we are not able to capture for the moment, but which is now coming on the top of the agenda. For example, what is the role played by small and medium-sized enterprises and SME to help multinational or not? And this question is rising in at least European countries. And fifth, and it's the last one, for income, we could also show, to help the building of new framework, that with existing statistics, balance of payment statistics, we can show something, we can tell a story. Maybe I will have time Wednesday to show it, but for example, for China, if you isolate the right lines with at least mainly multinational relationships, you can show that you got a surplus of $300 billion, but $200 billion of transfers off by multinationals. And we can show it in several countries to explain. We need more details to understand that process. But we have bricks to tell the story. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I really want to move on, because otherwise we're running simply out of time, Nadim, and I'm conscious about... so I think can you take it up bilaterally? Because this is a discussion that will take place also on Wednesday, and certainly about foreign...
I'll answer one of the questions then. I think it's important that we clarify this one in terms of non-exporting and exporting firms. I think it's absolutely true, of course, that when we're talking about the GVC narrative, we need to be able to reflect how non-exporting firms who are upstream provide goods and services to the exporters. The framework that we presented, of course, will allow that to be measured. But of course, the challenge is to make sure that we're able to identify the sales from non-exporting firms to exporting firms. This is part of the work that we'll have to look at going forward. And certainly a distinction between MNEs that are foreign-owned and domestic-owned is part of the longer-term agenda, as you'll know from the note that I sent recently that says this is something we could also explore. But the rest of them we can talk about afterwards.
Yeah. These are very interesting and intriguing questions that we have to address, so we will address them. We don't have to solve them now. Steve, may I invite you to address the issue on the new system of extended international accounts, implication and challenges. For those who do not know Steve Lenneveld, let me just briefly introduce him. He's recently retired, actually, in June in the summer of this year. He is well known to the statistical community as a real champion, and his work as director of the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Let me also indicate that he's very much knowledgeable about these environments that we talk about in terms of globalization and international accounts, because he has worked extensively in these areas before he became director of the BEA at BEA. And also why he's very well placed to have a talk on this is because he has pioneered a lot of statistical and management initiatives that has brought together a lot of these challenges that we face today. He also has, in his role as Chief of Staff of the President's Council, he has worked in this area extensively. And if that's not enough, he definitely already received for his work the President Distinguished Executive Award for the work he has done for the US. So with that, Steve, you're a rock star, so there you go.
Okay. I must say, the notion that, that you think of a career statistician as a rock star is an interesting comment on this gathering, but we'll pass over that. Okay, so let's start by what I was asked to do. Do I point this here? Am I doing this right? Or? Oh, I've got it upside down. Okay, start. Okay, it's a little broader. What I was asked to look at is a little broader than what we've been talking about here. And as I read the UN Statistical Mission Charge in 2014, it was to pull together a whole bunch of measurement challenges in the area of trade and globalization. One, it's interesting, is, and this may be about boxes and other things, but creation and coordination of an overarching measurement framework. You know, it's not a set of tools, but it is an overarching measurement framework. Secondly, they had in mind some specific issues they wanted to address, including trade, but also, interestingly, financial is in there, environmental, and I think this gets really far afield, but social integration at the same time. A lot of it has implications for social integration, but we heard some of this from the work of the OECD on their happiness well-being index. So certainly that is there. And then they had, they wanted special attention, and this sort of says to me they're thinking a lot about management issues, integration, data gaps, best practices, conceptual development, resources, coordination, data collection and sharing, protection and confidentiality. So there's a management focus on this sort of stuff, which you know, is pleasing to me. I've just recently finished chairing up a group that produced a set of guidelines for the UN on integrated economic statistics. And so I think it's important to wrap that kind of thing into this. Then there are specific challenges which we've been talking about here, value added, but not just value added, income and employment. I work for a lot of secretaries and brief presidents and others, and you know, GDP is interesting, but it's all about jobs. So you know, that has to be an essential component of it. Global production chains, a lot of things we've been talking about here. So I read this, and I go, oh God. I'm a veteran of the System of National Accounts revision, Balance Payments Manual revision, you know, international investment, I go on. And you know, the notion that we need another system, I'm kind of going, come on now, really? But, you know, I've been thinking about this for a while as I've approached it, and I think Dr. Soho was right. The system is broken. It's not conveying to policymakers the essential information it conveys. And as one who comes from a national accounts tradition, particularly strong in the United States, the national accounts, and I believe economic statistics in general, are created for the purposes of being relevant to policymaking. That means they've got to be up to date, they've got to be timely, and they've got to be within the ambit of being relevant. They've got to be accurate. And I think our statistics today are not quite cutting it. So I think we have to move forward. To give you a summary of my perspective on this, I think we have to move forward. We've got to do so in a non-duplicative way. We hopefully, rather than trying to add this as a clone on to the existing system, as we try and re-engineer the existing system, build new vehicles, production systems, and statistics, we can make this part and parcel of what we otherwise have to do and do it in an incremental, stepwise fashion. I think we can make progress on this, and we need to move ahead with this kind of system. So, you know, what's the overview? You've seen a lot of this already, but the existing international statistics have not kept up. Now, let's be clear, they remain invaluable. We're not talking about getting rid of those core statistics, but we need the extension of these because we've got to look through these extraordinarily complex international transactions. They are badly blurring our picture of what is happening in the world. Caveat, first they got to be based on the SNA and the Balance Payments Manual. We work very long and hard on those systems. We need to keep them. This has to be our core for them. Our task then, and we've heard a lot about this, is integration and reconciliation. How do we reconcile those large bilateral asymmetries, which may make both the United States and the UK happy that they both have surpluses, but isn't realistic in a statistical world? Those have to be taken into account. And I think the point made here that those have to be done through bilateral reconciliation of the experts is important, because just because you have a difference, you can't just split the difference. You've got to look at the quality of the underlying data. Is this survey-based? You know, how is the data derived? And so you're going to have to do that on a case-by-case basis, much as we've done some of that work with Canada and trying to, I don't work for the U.S. system anymore. The U.S. has done that over the years. So you got to do that. Integration and reconciliation is key to this for that core data. And then bring in these new accounting concepts like the global supply and use, the fascinating and really cool work that's been done on these value-added estimates at the country level, at the level of the OECD, to produce these kinds of statistics. So why has it gotten worse? Because firms have always maximized production efficiencies as well as lowering taxes by organizing across national boundaries. But advances in technology and communication and reduction in shipping have really accelerated the pace of this global production. And it's been really great for the economy, but it's really caused terribly difficult problems for the measurement of economic activity. You know, we just heard this, is it's got a lot of double counting. Now, I say double counting not just in the real sense, but we touched on a little bit when we talked about foreign direct investment, that there's an awful lot going on in the financial sector. I think one of the most important lessons we learned from the financial crisis was how bad our information systems were on the financial side. And let me just go on. You get the double counting on both sides. Nadim just did this one for you, except I put in the example of the United States, China, and the United Kingdom, so maybe it had hit home a little closer. But essentially, it looks like, say, in electronics, it looks like there's a deficit, significant deficit between the UK and China, but when you look at it on a value-added basis, it's really the US is where it's happening, if we look through those transactions. You got the same thing in the financial sector. This is a case which almost comes straight out of the financial crisis. The US financial institution puts together these mortgage-backed securities. They sell it to the UK unit, who again repackages them. It goes to Germany. It looks to Germany the way most current balance payments flows are recorded as opposed to benchmarked ones. It looks like there are liabilities with the US. So here we hear German authorities during the financial crisis and EU officials at the European Central Bank saying, that's an American problem. It doesn't involve us. They start looking more closely. They were in it big time. They had real problems because of where those mortgage-backed securities were held, and they were held in Germany. So, you know, a lot of your problems came from that kind of existing sets of accounts. Still important, but nonetheless significant problems. So what does this extended system look like that at least I envision from that UN charge? Is you got the core of the national and balance payments accounts, okay? And you've got to do work to, quote, bring them up to standard, because not everybody's up to standard. And for at least where it's important to the countries, you've got to have complete sets of accounts, including balance sheets. You know, if there's one thing macro policy people learned out of the financial crisis and the Great Depression, it's not a real world anymore. You've got to couple your real and financial worlds, because most, as we look back even, many of our business cycles actually had a strong asset balance sheet component to them over the years, and certainly the last one was absolutely based in that. So for those countries that are systemically important, you've got to have sets of balance sheets. Then you've got to have these global supply and use and financial accounts. You've got to have what a corporation might call consolidated accounts. So you look through all these transactions, or in the case of what we call foreign direct investment. We heard this talked about. Who is the ultimate beneficial owner? Because that's real important, because in the United States we've had the share of foreign direct investment, which is through what you might call tax haven countries, has risen from like 17 to 44% over a couple decades. So you got an awful lot of stuff going through. these special purpose entities, and it's hard to tell exactly what's happening, which is the reason why you put that on an ultimate beneficial owner basis. Or for the creditor or debtor, you need that same sort of basis. So how is it important for public policy? Dr. Soho said that they're already reaping the fruits of this new set of value-added estimates that they've put together. And I think it is, when you drill down through these kinds of things, you begin to see the dependencies in trade. The term fragmentation is what I'm thinking about, but the dependencies, how much of, we just talked about, how much of the non-exporting sector actually derives significant benefits from trade. How much of those foreign imports are really content from your country or value added that ends up in your country. So, that kind of fuller picture, I think, is extraordinarily important. And I just wanted to go through. And by the way, has everybody seen this iPhone study? I mean, this is a fascinating little case study. I mean, everybody I talk to in the U.S. goes, look at this thing, made in China. There's just this huge angst over it. But when you look at least from this case study, it looks like inputs of $11 from the U.S., inputs from other countries, $162, manufacturing cost going to China of only $650. Then you got this huge margin between the wholesale price of $179 to $499, which stays here in the United States. So, when we talk about that Chinese good and we get our trade dander up about it, we're really quite misdirected, at least if this case study. Case studies are case studies, so I don't know what to make of that. So, but along comes the OECD and a bunch of other people, and they're making these really interesting estimates. Well, they try and use the existing statistics, shape them up a bit. And when I look at something like China's bilateral trade with the U.S., it's like 1/3 smaller on a value-added basis than on the official gross flows basis. That's a pretty significant number. And, what's happening is, like this example of the apple, is the OECD estimates, because of these assembly and processing of components, has caused a rise in the foreign content of Chinese exports from 12% to 33% in 2009. And we can talk a lot about, proportionality, heterogeneity, Ed Lemer's suggestion that basically you should never use IO accounts for this kind of stuff. But I think they present reasonable and I think robust numbers in the form that the OECD has put them together. And they produce a large range of these estimates, which are interesting for policy analysis. You got at the upper end foreign content of roughly 40% or more with those countries, Luxembourg, some of the countries you guess, Ireland, Taiwan. But at the lower end, you got other countries such as the US and Brazil at 10% or less. So there's a lot of different implications to this. It's not like, oh yeah, everybody kind of falls in the same basket. No, they fall in different baskets, so you got to really look at each one. Another thing is this notion of reminding domestic non-export industries how important trade is to them. Because according to these OECD estimates, which makes sense to me, the services account for over half of total value-added exports for the US, the UK, France, Germany, and Italy. What is that stuff? Well, it's, management, design, the cool design in the iPad, the R&D that goes into it, logistical, legal, financial, and other services that are inputs to those exports. You also got on the other side, when the import actually arrives in the U.S., you got significant domestic transportation. I've got to transport the goods. I got to wholesale them, advertise them, got to get the financing for it. So you got a lot selling those. And if I looked at, say, U.S. input-output accounts, I might be saying 15% of the final price should also be added when I look at those kind of situations. So what does it do? And this is pretty important when we think about what's the impact of this stuff. So value-added measures will not change overall trade balances, but will change bilateral balances, okay? So it'll loan with countries near the end of the value processing chain and those assimilating final goods and services. Okay, so that's the China, it comes down kind of example. Also lower them with neighboring countries that they conduit for the trade. They ship them over, and so since we're looking at just last country you dealt with, that a lot of it gets put there. You have the same problem, by the way, in financial markets. You look at a lot of that data, it looks like everything goes through major financial market centers. All our assets and liabilities are counted with the London, the exchanges there, and those kinds of things. And you got to look through those transactions. Another interesting implication is value-add estimates, by eliminating double counting of trade, will also lower total exports and imports. Now we start to get into, in addition to the change in the bilateral and the change in the total exports, we begin into the big political fight I think you're going to run into on these kind of estimates, which is, one, China. It's much easier to look at one protagonist who's one bad guy. That's a simple story. Whereas if I have to start going through that iPhone story of whose imports we gain, but then there's the overseas sales, how does this work out? That's not a story people like. They know what the protagonist is in the story they're hearing, and they don't want that changed. Secondly, you might hear, as and I'll tell you this story in just a minute, but the administration can't make the economy better, so they're making it look better by reducing total exports and imports. This happened recently in the U.S. in a big way. So it's terribly important for trade and investment policy, and Nadim, I got this out of one of your reports, but I love this example you gave of EU trade sanctions against footwear made in Asia, where estimates are that 80% of the value added of the Asian-made footwear originated in the EU. Pardon the pun, but talk about shooting yourself in the foot. So you got unfair trade practices, and I think this applies the Chinese case for the U.S. There's just this undue attention to the Chinese trade deficit. So you've got all these kinds of cases going on at huge cost. And I think some rethinking of that and what the actual value-added data would be important. Tax policy. We do these kind of static analyses of tax policy. I talked to my son who works at the Joint Committee on Taxation about this stuff. And it's all static. Nobody ever asks, okay, what if that company couldn't exist or compete without those overseas sourcing arrangements? We might lose a lot. Take the Apple example. If it is to be true, we gain a lot from that. But that sort of is not taken into account in your traditional tax analysis. So all these kinds of tax analyses, particularly in countries that, like the United States, worried about inversions of corporate entities. You got a real issue there in terms of not using dynamic analysis. And you've got to look through these. As I said before, over 40% of foreign direct investment is through tax havens. Financial regulatory macro policy. Lessons of the financial crisis, I've said this before, but I'm just stunned by it. And even when you look on the U.S. side, for example, they had no idea the buildup of leveraging and liability. A lot of that had to do with their international assets and liabilities. They couldn't even tell from their end what was happening. Another big problem and another issue that has to be addressed in this sort of major program is setting long-term targets for inflation, sustainable growth, and productivity. Those kind of things are essential to macro policy. What is your sustainable growth rate? And I don't know if you've looked at some of these studies, but some studies suggest you might have a bias in inflation of as much as 0.5%. Biases in real GDP growth of 0.5% because of the problems, and I won't go into them, of capturing these data. So I think an essential part of this whole program has got to be, as the charge laid out, addressing the measurement biases. All right, so let's quickly try and then we've heard very well explained the environmental and energy policies. You know, are we just exporting? I keep invoking China, but from the U.S. perspective, are we just exporting our pollution to China for the goods they produce or assemble for us? And then you've got these other areas that have been touched on as well. And I'd just like to emphasize business and financial decisions. Everything that's true here about why policymakers need to do it are equally true for businesses. They really want to know what the value added to it, what their ultimate customers are, what's happening in the background. They want to benchmark themselves against those things. So what would be my suggestion for moving forward is, one is maximizing the bang for the buck. You know, while we're trying to fix all our core statistics and update and improve those sets of statistics, let's try and build this in, this standardization, harmonization, those kind of things that are going on. Let's prepare ourselves for the big data. We could talk about that at some length, but let's get ready for that by harmonizing accounting systems. Those are longer term projects in some respects, shorter in others. And I would suggest that the focus in the short run might be to focus on these indirect supply and use tables and some of these ultimate beneficial owner tables, trying to shore up heterogeneity issues. Try and shore up some of those issues, because I think you're going to have a big problem when we get to this, because we talked about increases in cost and respondent burden. You run a complex set of corporate or enterprise surveys, they are extraordinarily burdensome. Then you start trying to add all this extra information that you're interested in getting at for heterogeneity, they're going to scream bloody murder. A lot of them don't have that data in their sets of accounts right now. Some of them do. Some have very nice supply chain data and are able to trace this stuff back. But the U.S. experience thus far is a lot don't. And they're very unhappy with the complex forms they already have to fill out. Finally is this, you've got to reach out and get support, because what happened in the U.S. is the proposal was put forth in the U.S. Federal Register saying we're going to start measuring manufacturing for factoryless firms, which logically got you right to what the kind of conclusions you're getting out of this value-added analysis, a smaller deficits with China, smaller total exports, imports, manufacturing becomes healthier and better. There was an extraordinarily well-organized opposition to this amongst the trade-sensitive sectors. Lots and lots of letters. They got to the White House. They managed to get it to Congress. The program is now, never mind, we're going to do research. We're not going to do anything right now. I'm willing to bet there are plenty of French farmers out there and other trade-sensitive sectors who like having one protagonist out there, don't want their data changed. So I think you may want to work on those indirect things, try and sell these, try and convince your constituents and try and work with them to do these new accounting procedures and direct survey collections in the lowest cost way possible while you're working on your outreach and working on these collection programs. We covered that. We're running out of time quickly. I think in organizing for implementation and thinking about this, particularly if it really is going to be this bigger umbrella of real and financial sets of accounts. Incentives and relative strengths, you might say, for example, at the international level, I would say keep the IMF doing those sets of integrated financial accounts, but make sure that some oversight body, perhaps the UN, who's sort of the umbrella body, sort of be thinking about the coordination of that work at the IMF, which they already are. But what are the implications for national accounts and other economic statistics in this overarching framework that their Friends of the Chair Committee has asked them to develop? On the other hand, if I look at, for example, what institution has done, it seems to me, the most work on these value-added sets of accounts, I think OECD should be leading those kinds of efforts. When I think of perhaps just the measurement problems that occur, that might be UNEC Europe, who's done some stuff there. But I think you want to tag people's relative strengths, and then you want to go down to the country level. And it's not just the major developed economies who should be leading this. As Dr. Soho indicated, these kind of issues are very important for Mexico as well. So it's not we need to think of different partners in terms of the leadership of these groups, and they also have to have the incentives themselves because there's a lot of work. And I think, finally, there is a need for a strong management component on this whole thing. You got a lot of things running around. Even if you're successful in developing this overarching framework for this, then I think someone's got to be there, or some group, putting together what are the dates, where are things falling apart, what are the contingency plans, moving this thing forward, because I do think it's an incredibly important exercise, but incredibly challenging exercise. So I think that strong management control is very important. I had some questions at the back of my paper, and I don't know, Ivo, if you want to use them at some other point, or we are out of time at this point. So, but I had some questions, and a lot of them deal with one central one. I think is just can we get by with improved indirect estimates for a period of time? Are they good enough for policy use after we've improved them a bit, and focus on that sort of thing? Or do you think we need to move directly to a major effort to begin direct survey collection? Because I think that path is going to be real difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, to send it out and bringing also that you know, the various aspects in terms of a conceptual framework and the aspect of management of that overall sort of implementations interview. I think we still want to give us some time, maybe another 5 minutes, to basically you know, get some questions from the floor. Yes, please, Richie.
Thank you, Steve. Just want to congratulate you on this really well-presented paper. So we read it, and also you mentioned IMF, so I want to just clarify under your question number 1, scope. So you mentioned to keep the IMF away from this framework. So my understanding is that this project will not encompass the cross-border financial data.
My suggestion was that it should cover the cross-border financial data because it's so integral to national accounts and understanding the economy. But leadership on it should be left with the International Monetary Fund, who is leading the effort to develop consolidated, real, and financial accounts. You know, I think the last thing we need is duplication of effort. So I'm just saying this particular group might not have to worry so much about it, but it should worry about it in developing the overarching framework as to how all these connections get made between the financial and the real side if they are different than the ones currently specified under the S&A and the Balance of Payments Manual. So that's, I didn't mean,
I think our view is that because we already have a existing international governance structure on the financial side. So I just want to clarify. And also, we also want to mention, I didn't get comment on Nadim's presentation, but we just want to say we support the work of the OECD. It's well done, and we'll continue to work with the OECD's leadership on this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Steve. I'm going to confess that I read your paper on the plane yesterday. I really enjoyed it. And I know we've been talking about, you know, towards a new system of I don't know, for lack of a better term, I think of integrated global accounts maybe, since the last Friends of the Chair meeting. And I know the UN we've talked about it since then, and we've talked about maybe we need some sort of an international manual. I was kind of a skeptic until I read Steve's paper, and then it kind of convinced me that a lot of the things we've been talking about here does need that overarching framework. So I've pretty much changed my mind on that, and I think one of the things we should be working on in the short term is developing such a conceptual framework. I think Steve's paper gives us a good overview of the issues and the breadth of such a framework, what it should be, as well as underlying the policy analytic needs and the challenges. And when we think of the conceptual framework, I mean, obviously we need the supply use tables, the production data, the trade, but I like the FDI and FAS rolled in. I think the portfolio investment through the G20 has to be rolled in. The management of that is another matter altogether because we know the different international agencies have jurisdiction there. But we do need an overarching framework, and it reminds me back of the initial schematic we presented last year at the Friends of the Chair, where we sort of had the national dimension heading towards the global dimension, the micro and the macro angles, and I think what Steve presented is kind of an extension of that, and ultimately with the goal for a kind of a global set of national accounts isn't that dissimilar for the national set. Basically, it's to shed light on global economic and financial stability and sustainability, and I think that's exactly what we want to do with this work, either the Friends or the Chair, whatever comes out of it. So I would argue we should start thinking about that conceptual framework sooner rather than later, and I'm reversing my position from last week, and I don't mind admitting I was wrong on that. In terms of the method side, though, Steve made some very good points. I think there are a lot of issues there. That's a different angle. I think first comes the conceptual framework, and then we think about what are the methods to achieve harmonious data across all of these things. And I come back to Nadim's presentation. The thing that tweaked my interest was the bilateral data asymmetries that he talked about and multilateral data asymmetries. And one of the things I think we see that in the trade, but I think we'll also see it in the trade and income and in the FDI positions as well. So it'd be nice to think of sooner rather than later as a small step towards the methods. What are some of the mechanisms we could put in place to start addressing some of those bilateral, multilateral data asymmetries? So I just want to, support this idea for a good conceptual framework. I think we've got the background note now, and I would put that sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, for that confirmation. Our colleague from China.
I have a little forward-looking questions. Stephen, you mentioned about we need to provide the age of big data. So I have some questions. Want to see what your thoughts on this, because you say we're talking about the globalization of production, but actually right now have a globalization of consumption. You see the Alibaba, see the eBay, see the Amazon, all the big data based on the e-commerce will raise new challenges, but give statistical committee and the economists new opportunity to study the form and consumer behavior. What are your view on the big data or e-commerce based data will play a role in the future? Thank you.
Well, since I'm standing between all of you and lunch, quickly, I think big data is extremely important, and as I lay out in the paper, it's very important that we consider that as part of the plans. But my experience is that it is no panacea. In some areas, the big data works very well. In other areas, despite it being lots of data, it isn't very representative data, or the concept used is different. And so, I'm actually working on another paper for the UN on that, where I sort of go through examples of where big microdata would be helpful and others where it would not be helpful. One example from the United States is it says that the U.S. healthcare system is plunging, but employment in the healthcare is one of the only bright spots in the U.S. economy. And while I may have questions about the employment data in general, I don't believe it's plunging, which is what the available big data on small business enterprises in the health sector would tell you. So anyway, no panacea, but something we definitely have to work on.
Yeah, I stand corrected, Yuan. You're not from China. You're an American national, so my apologies.
Could I just make a very short comment? I think it's quite something exciting that is in a way happening in this community, and I think it's quite a ambitious. Obviously, it's an ambitious and big program of work that people thinking about, and really, it seems to me really. An attempt is being made, at least. Maybe it's a revolt, maybe it's a revolution, but really to put together data in a completely different way and allowing us to see this world that has changed so much through a completely different lens. Now, I think what is maybe slightly tragic about this is that outside of this community, I think there's very little awareness of this big push that is happening here. So Nadim was saying that obviously some of the ministries and some of the people in the statistical community have swung behind this, and that's very, very important. But I think there's a lot of scope to make this more publicly visible, because I think when you start talking about iPhones and Alibabas and all of that, that is really something that doesn't only interest the statistical community, but it actually interests the world out there. And when you start talking about shifting of taxes and how these global value chains work, so I think there's in that work that a group of the Friends of the Chair is doing and what's happening on the post-2015 agenda, I think there is something that should be highlighted more clearly, and it should be somehow packaged more clearly. Probably it shouldn't be called supply use tables with extended environmental accounts. And I mean, there is a kind of how do you push this idea through? But to really say, okay, we don't have the statistical frameworks to deal with this new globalized world. I think that's a very important message, and I think that's also a message that people can quite easily grasp, because they see the world changing around them in so many ways. So, generating some enthusiasm around that, funding, but also public support for this is, I think, something that could be an interesting addition to trying to think about, okay, how do you manage all of this, and how do you conceptually make this thing work?
At this point, I think everybody is thinking about lunch. I would like then to draw it to a close. You know, although I chaired it, I thought it was a fascinating morning session with some excellent speakers. So in order, I just want to, you know, thank Arnold, Nadim, Jaco, and Steve for their, you know, excellent presentation that really set, you know, the scene very well around the issues that we would like to discuss, around the conceptual framework. You know, somehow, if you're on 30,000 feet, you seem to be, you know, convinced, like Patrick, and I think that seemed to be a step in a direction. There's issues, I think, that we have to talk about the various sort of components of that work program. We have used the word boxes. That's where we will talk about. I think Steve also brought out very neatly that there's choices to be made in the direction of indirect measures, while you will also have to work on direct measures. The 2008 SNA rather said, look, let's measure them directly, but we have the underlying instrument has to be developed. Probably there's a middle of the road to be found, because we cannot measure everything through direct, and we need the indirect, particularly also if you want to look at these environmental related and societally related sort of issues, which are very important. There are exciting times. The political economy has set the bar very high, and thank you for reminding us, and I think we will meet that challenge, and hopefully by the end of the day of the conference, and then towards the Friends of the Chair meeting, we will be able to come to recommendations that we will be able to bring to the statistical community. And I think we will also have to discuss at some point, and you nicely mentioned that, Steve, also the overall sort of management issue, because the management issue on these issues are very critical, not only at the international level, but also be drivers towards the national statistical systems to basically help us to get the data that we need. With that, I like to ask you to give our speakers a hand for their excellent presentation. We're not so far over time, so I think that we could resume, I think at the time that we indicated, that is at 14:30, and I would like to wish you a very healthy lunch. Thank you very much.
Les agradeceremos apagar el equipo de interpretación durante el receso. Gracias.